Hello, I'm Joshua Devora, and this is my video for homework assignment number 2. Proprioception is your body's ability to detect and subconsciously understand its own position and movement of its joints and limbs without actually needing to look at them. It allows us to do things and know things like where our arms and legs are in space, and helps us maintain things like posture, balance, coordination, and efficient movement. Basically knowing where our limbs are in space. Proprioception is made possible by specialized sensory receptors known as proprioceptors. Proprioceptors are actually located within the joints, muscles, and tendons. These proprioceptors are continuously relaying information about our limbs, our arms, where they're at, back to our central nervous system. Since it does this, our brain is able to know and detect things about the position of our body parts, where they're at in relative to gravity and space. Much of this is actually done kind of in the background subconsciously. Like we mentioned before earlier, we don't have to look at our hands, our legs, our arms with our eyes to know where they are relative to space and gravity. For kinesiology students, and more specifically our class, and athletes, proprioception is an important concept for us to understand, and it's especially important because it helps us do things like improve movement, like accuracy, reaction time, balance, agility, and especially helps us with things like injury prevention. Proprioception is important because it helps our body make rapid movements, like make rapid adjustments in order to maintain proper movement, especially in our athletes. With the athletes that we are going to work with, they're going to go through many sports-specific motions like jumping, sprinting, changing directions, and lifting weights. So it's important for us to understand how the body is going to naturally respond and be conscious of their limbs and arms. So now we're going to talk about muscle spindles. These are one of the most important proprioceptors discussed in this chapter. These muscle spindles are sensory receptors that are located inside skeletal muscles. They are made up of modified muscle fibers and are enclosed in a sheet of connective tissue. What's interesting about these muscle spindles, are that they are actually parallel to the regular muscle fibers. The main role of a muscle spindle is to detect change and provide information about changes in muscle length and the speed or how quickly that muscle is being stretched. See, when the muscle is being stretched, the muscle spindle is actually being stretched as well. When this happens, it actually activates the sensory neuron of that muscle spindle and then immediately sends the signal back through the spinal cord, back to the central nervous system. The nervous system then receives this information and it quickly responds by activating the motor neurons that actually innervate that same muscle. Thus, the same muscle is able to contract. The mechanism allows our body to prevent excessive stretching and deformation that would damage the muscles or the connective tissue. Another key thing to know is that as the load increases and the muscle becomes even more stretched or deformed, the muscle spindles are engaged, which results in either greater activation of those same muscle spindles or the muscle. So again, the main thing to know is that when the deformation of the stretch of the muscle occurs, the same muscle spindles of that muscle have their sensory neuron activated, which then sends the signal through the spinal cord back to the central nervous system. So when muscle spindles are activated, they produce what is known as the stretch reflex in our textbook. In our textbook, we are provided with the knee-jerk reflex example. The stretch reflex most of the time occurs automatically without subconsciously. So to review the process of what that looks like, first our muscle experiences a random stretch or deformation, mainly a stretch. Next, the muscle spindle will sense the amount of length amount of stretch and speed of that stretch, and then the sensory neurons are activated and send an impulse back to the spinal cord. At the spinal cord, this impulse connects with motor neurons. Then the spinal cord will immediately send back a motor signal back to that same muscle. This results in the activation of motor neurons that actually innervate that same muscle, until finally the muscle contracts in order to resist that stretch. In the book, we are provided with the knee jerk reflex. Most of us have experienced this when we visit the doctor's office, and when we go to that doctor, he usually has us sit on the edge of a table and relax our leg, and then suddenly he will tap the patellar tendon, which will actively stretch the quadriceps muscle and the muscle spindle fibers. When this happens, the muscle spindle actually detects that stretch and results in the activation of extrafusal muscle fibers in that same muscle. In the end, the result being our quadriceps muscles contracting, which makes our lower leg kick forward. Now we are going to move over to chapter 3, where we are going to look at carbohydrates, and more specifically how they are processed in the human body. So first of all, what are carbohydrates? Carbohydrates are one of the body's primary sources of energy, especially during moderate and high-intensity exercise. Carbohydrates are important because out of all of the 3 main macronutrients, which includes carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, carbohydrates are the only ones that can be broken down for energy without the involvement of oxygen, which make it super important during anaerobic metabolism. So when we eat carbohydrates, they eventually become digested and are eventually broken down into glucose. When that glucose enters our bloodstream, it can follow several different pathways. Some of that glucose is immediately used by the cells in order to produce ATP, which becomes usable energy for the body. Some glucose is stored as glycogen inside our skeletal muscles, and finally some additional glucose becomes glycogen in the liver. If, however, some of that carbohydrate intake exceeds that of our body's storage capacity, then excess glucose can be converted into fat for long-term energy storage. We also learned that muscle glycogen is especially important, and is important because for athletes it provides a readily available source of fuel during training, during workouts, or during exercise. So now we'll talk about how carbohydrates can produce energy through 2 different pathways. The first one we'll talk about is anaerobic metabolism. Of course, by now we know that anaerobic means without oxygen. So when we do high-intensity exercise, our body needs energy faster than oxygen can be delivered. Therefore, glucose is broken down through glycolysis, which produces ATP very quickly. One advantage of anaerobic metabolism is that ATP can be rapidly produced. However, through this way, it can only be provided for a short period of time because fatigue develops quickly as metabolic byproducts begin to build up. This occurs in things like sprinting, heavy resistance training, jumpings, and other high-intensity efforts. The second pathway we are going to talk about is aerobic metabolism, which again, by now we know that aerobic means with oxygen. So when oxygen is available, glucose enters the mitochondria, where it is broken down through the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. Although with aerobic metabolism, ATP is produced slower, it does generate much more larger amounts of ATP so that it can support exercise for longer periods of time. Examples of this include distance running, cycling, swimming, and other longer duration exercises. So now we will talk about how these 2 pathways are directly related to athletic performance. So, when athletes do more explosive events, they primarily depend on the anaerobic carbohydrate metabolism because they need rapid ATP production. However, long-endurance athletes need to spend more time on the aerobic metabolism because they need a continuous supply of energy throughout their entire workout, which is usually for longer periods of time. However, many sports actually use both systems together since exercise intensity is constantly changing throughout competition. The body can shift between the anaerobic and aerobic metabolism depending on the energy demands of your body. Now we are going to talk about the triangulation method. In this method, there are three major energy systems: the ATP-PC system, also known as the phosphagen system, the anaerobic glycolytic system, and the aerobic oxidative system. And in every sport, every athlete uses all three systems. However, each sport relies on these major energy systems in different proportions. For example, we're going to talk about a 100-meter sprint athlete. For the sprint, the athlete would typically mainly use the phosphagen corner of the triangle. In a 100-meter sprint, the race typically only lasts for about 10 seconds, which requires the athlete to use maximum power and speed. Therefore, most of the energy comes from the stored ATP and phosphocreatine. Now we're going to talk about a soccer goalkeeper. He would be in the position somewhere between the phosphagen system and the aerobic system of the triangle. This is because most of the match for a soccer, a goalkeeper is typically involves standing, walking, or light movement, which mainly uses the aerobic system. However, goalkeepers occasionally have to perform explosive dives, jumps, or short sprints. These quick reactions require the phosphagen system. A soccer midfielder now would likely be positioned closer to the center of the triangle, but typically would lean toward the aerobic corner. In soccer, midfielders cover the greatest total distance during the game, often constantly having to run for the full 90 minutes. Therefore, most of their energy comes from the aerobic system. However, they do occasionally need to perform sprints, accelerate, or other jumps or other quick bursts of energy. These intense efforts require the anaerobic glycolysis and the phosphagen system.